You ever have one of those moments where you're looking at a person, just staring right into their eyes, and you realize they have absolutely no idea they're standing on a trapdoor that you're holding the lever to? That was me with Patty Vance, the self-proclaimed queen bee of Blackwood Cove, and let me tell you, watching her fall was the most satisfying, terrifying, and confusing moment of my entire 45 years on this planet. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday that's supposed to be irrelevant because I was retired, done, checked out. My name is Elias Thorne, and for 2 decades I worked as a forensic accountant in Chicago, which is just a fancy way of saying I spent 20 years hunting down money that powerful people tried to hide. I was burned out, cynical, and sick of staring at spreadsheets until my eyes bled, so I did what any sane person on the edge of a nervous breakdown would do. I bought a dilapidated cabin in the Pacific Northwest, sight unseen, just to smell pine trees instead of exhaust fumes. I wanted silence, I wanted the damp cold of the morning mist, and I wanted to drink my cheap instant coffee on my rotting wooden dock without hearing a single siren. But apparently, the universe has a twisted sense of humor, because 3 days after I moved in, while I'm sitting there in my flannel pajamas just watching the fog roll over the water, I hear the distinct, aggressive crunch of gravel behind me. It wasn't a friendly drive-by, it was an invasion. I turn around and there's this pristine, pearl-white SUV parked on my grass, not my driveway, my grass, and out steps a woman who looked like she was dressed for a brunch at a country club, not a muddy lakeside cabin. She had the blonde bob, the pastel blazer that cost more than my truck, and a clipboard that she wielded like a weapon of mass destruction. "Excuse me," she yelled, and it wasn't a question, it was a command. "You need to remove that structure immediately and vacate the shoreline, this is a restricted visual zone." I just looked at her, blinking, holding my coffee mug like a shield. I said, "Lady, I'm drinking coffee on my own dock, the only thing I'm removing is the silence I was enjoying." That was the wrong thing to say to Patricia, Patty Vance. She marched down that hill, stiletto heels sinking into the mud, which gave me a little spark of joy, and got right in my face. She told me she was the president of the Blackwood Cove Heritage Association, a title that sounded made up but apparently carried the weight of God in this little valley. She claimed my cabin was an eyesore, that my dock was non-compliant with the aesthetic guidelines of 2004, and that I was technically trespassing on community aquatic assets. I told her to get off my property before I called the sheriff. She laughed, a dry, humorless sound like cracking knuckles. "Honey," she said, dripping with that fake sweetness that hides a jagged knife, "I have the sheriff on speed dial, I have the county commissioner at my dinner table every Sunday. You're just a squatter in a teardown shack. You have 24 hours to cease all activity and submit a demolition plan, or I will bury you in so many fines you'll be selling your organs to pay for gas." Then she took a photo of me with her phone, flash on, right in my face, turned around, and drove off, tearing up my lawn as a parting gift. I stood there shaking, not from fear, but from that old, familiar rage I used to feel when I caught a CEO embezzling pension funds. I thought I left the fight in Chicago, but clearly, the fight followed me here. Over the next week, life became a living hell. I'd wake up to bright orange violation stickers plastered on my front door, citations for unauthorized vegetation, fines for improper vehicle storage, warnings about noise pollution, because I was listening to the radio while fixing my roof. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. I found out from the local mailman, a terrified kid who looked like he wanted to sprint past my house, that Patty was trying to push me out so she could sell the land to a luxury developer named Sterling Heights. Apparently, she'd promised them a private, exclusive waterfront, and my raggedy cabin was the only zit on her perfect complexion. But the breaking point came on a Saturday. I was down at the local hardware store, buying nails, when an old guy in grease-stained overalls tapped me on the shoulder. His name was Miller, looked like he'd been carved out of driftwood, local mechanic, 60 years in the valley. "You're the new guy in the Thorne place," he grunted, looking around like he was afraid of being seen talking to me. "Patty's got a bounty on your head, son. She's telling folks you're a drug runner from the city, says you're bringing down property values just by breathing air." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "I'm an accountant, Miller. The most illegal thing I've done is jaywalk. Why does she care so much? Miller leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. It ain't about the view, it's the deal. Patty's getting a kickback. A big one. She's selling the heritage rights to the developers, claiming the HOA owns the waterfront access. If she sells, she retires to Florida with a couple million. If you stay, the deal dies. She's desperate, and a desperate Patty Vance is dangerous. That hit a nerve. In my line of work, you learn that when people get greedy, they get sloppy. Patty was acting like she owned the place, literally owned it, but legal ownership is a tricky, specific thing, and fraudsters always miss one detail. I went home that night, not to sleep, but to dig. I stopped fixing the roof and started fixing the problem. I climbed up into the crawlspace attic of the cabin, a place filled with cobwebs and the smell of ancient dust. The previous owner had left everything, old furniture, clothes, boxes of junk. I started tearing through it, looking for anything, a deed, a survey, a letter. Hours passed. My knees were aching, my flashlight was dying, and I was about to give up when I found a heavy, iron-bound chest tucked under the eaves. Inside wasn't treasure, but something better, paper. Yellowed, brittle, crumbling paper. It was a ledger from a logging company, the Blackwood Timber and Mining Company, dated 1882. I started reading, squinting at the fancy cursive handwriting. It detailed land grants, railway easements, and property lines from before the county was even a county. And then I saw the name. Elias Thorne. My great-great-grandfather. I froze. I knew my family had roots out west, but I thought they were poor farmers who lost everything in the Dust Bowl. But here, in this ledger, was a land grant and sovereignty charter, signed by the territorial governor. It outlined a purchase of 850 acres, encompassing the entire cove, the mountain ridge, and the valley floor where the modern subdivision now sat. My heart started hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I kept reading. There was a clause, a reversionary interest clause. It stated that if the Blackwood Timber Company ever dissolved without a successor, the land rights wouldn't revert to the state, they would revert to the lineal descendants of the primary shareholder. I flipped to the back of the ledger. Primary shareholder, Elias Thorne. I sat there in the dark, breathing in the dust, realizing that this wasn't just a cabin. This wasn't just a lake. This was mine. All of it. The road Patty drove on. Mine. The land her tacky McMansion sat on. Mine. The water she claimed was an exclusive community asset. Mine. But in the world of law, finding a dusty paper is one thing, proving it is another. I needed to be sure. I spent the next 3 days in a fever state. I drove 2 towns over to the county archives, buried myself in microfiche, cross-referencing tax maps from the 1920s, zoning changes from the 50s, and the subdivision plans from the 90s. And that's when I found the smoking gun, or rather, the missing link. When the subdivision was built 20 years ago, the developers, a company that went bankrupt shortly after, never actually bought the land title. They bought a 99-year lease from a holding company that they thought owned the land. But that holding company was a shell, and the original title had never been transferred. It was still sitting in limbo, legally attached to the dormant Blackwood Timber Charter. Patty Vance wasn't the HOA president of a private community. She was the squatter. She was the one trespassing. And she was about to sell land she didn't own to a developer who didn't do his due diligence. I drove back to the cabin with a stack of certified copies in the passenger seat, feeling a strange mix of adrenaline and calm. I pulled into my driveway and saw it, a massive, neon-orange notice of eviction and demolition sign staples to my front porch. Patty was standing there with 2 private security guards and a man in a suit who looked like he cost more than the security guards combined. I got out of my truck, clutching my folder. Patty smirked at me, adjusting her sunglasses. Game over, Elias. This is Mr. Sterling, the developer. We've managed to expedite the seizure of this property due to hazardous neglect. You have 2 hours to vacate before the bulldozers get here. Mr. Sterling looked bored, checking his watch. Nothing personal, he said, business is business. I looked at Patty, then at Sterling, and I couldn't help it, I started laughing. A deep, belly laugh that made the security guards nervous. You think this is funny? Patty shrieked, her composure cracking. You're homeless. No, Patty, I said, wiping a tear from my eye. I'm not laughing because I'm homeless. I'm laughing because you just threatened to bulldoze your landlord's house. I am the authority here, she screamed. We'll see about that, I said, my voice dropping to that cold, forensic tone I used to use right before I sent a CFO to federal prison. I'm calling an emergency town hall meeting. Tonight. At the community center. If you want to kick me out, do it in front of everyone. Do it in front of the neighbors you've been lying to. She sneered. Fine. It'll be a pleasure to humiliate you publicly. 7 p.m. Don't be late. As they drove off, I walked into my cabin, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table. I opened the folder. I had 5 hours to prepare for the biggest takedown of my life. The community center smelled like stale floor wax and anxiety. When I walked in at 6:55 p.m., the room was packed, not because people liked me, but because everyone loves a car crash, and Patty had promised them one. She had set up a projector, a podium, and rows of chairs like she was presiding over the Nuremberg trials. She sat at the front, flanked by Mr. Sterling and her silent board members, looking like a queen waiting for an execution. I walked in wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, holding nothing but a battered leather satchel. The murmurs started immediately. I could hear whispers of drug dealer, crazy squatter, and eyesore. Patty had done her job well, the whole town thought I was the villain. Patty tapped the microphone, the feedback screeching through the room. All right, settle down. We're here to formalize the removal of a non-compliant resident, Mr. Thorne, whose property has become a blight on our prestigious community. Mr. Sterling here has generously offered to purchase the lot and transform it into a luxury marina for all of us to enjoy. Applause. Polite, terrified applause. People were scared of her. I could see it in their eyes. They didn't love her, they just didn't want to be her next target. Mr. Thorne, Patty said, giving me a pitying smile. Do you have anything to say before we vote on the motion to seize? I stood up slowly. The room went dead silent. I walked to the front, ignoring the podium, and stood right in the center of the room. I don't have a defense for my eyesore cabin, I started, my voice clear and steady. But I do have a question for Mr. Sterling. Sterling looked up from his phone, annoyed. Make it quick. Did you run a title search on the waterfront property? Or did you just take Ms. Vance's word that the HOA held the deed? Sterling frowned. My legal team handled the preliminaries. The HOA has jurisdiction. Jurisdiction isn't ownership, I said, unbuckling my satchel. You see, folks, I used to be a forensic accountant. My job was finding things that people didn't want found. And when Ms. Vance here started fining me for breathing, I decided to look into the history of this valley. I pulled out the first document, the 1882 Charter. I held it up. This is the original land grant for Blackwood Cove. It was purchased by a man named Elias Thorne. My great-great-grandfather. Patty scoffed loud enough for the back row to hear. Oh, please. A family fairy tale. That's your defense. It's not a fairy tale, Patty, I said, pulling out the second document, the certified chain of title from the county. It's a legal reality. This entire subdivision, including the land your house sits on, was built on a 99-year lease that expired 3 years ago. The development company that built these homes didn't renew it because they went bankrupt. They assumed the land was worthless. I slammed the stack of papers onto the table in front of Sterling. The sound echoed like a gunshot. But the reversionary clause in the original charter is very specific. When the lease expires, the land rights don't disappear. They revert to the Thorne estate. Since I am the sole living heir, I don't just own my cabin. I turned to look directly at Patty, whose face had gone from smug to pale white. I own the road you drove here on. I own the community center we're standing in. I own the lake. And, Patty, I own the land under your house. Chaos. Absolute chaos. Mr. Sterling snatched the papers, his eyes scanning them frantically. His face turned a dangerous shade of red. He turned to Patty. You said you had clear title. You said the HOA controlled the land in fee simple. I. Patty was stammering, standing up, knocking her chair over. He's lying. It's a forgery. He's a criminal. Mr. Sterling, I said, cutting her off. If you check page 4, you'll see the county clerk's stamp from this morning. It's real. Which means, Patty, technically you are the squatter. You've been collecting HOA dues for 5 years on land you don't manage, enforcing rules you have no authority to make, and trying to sell my property to a third party. In the legal world, we call that fraud. Massive, federal-level wire fraud. The room erupted. Neighbors were standing up, shouting questions. What does this mean for our mortgages? Is my house mine? Where did our HOA money go? Patty looked like a trapped animal. She tried to grab the microphone, but Miller, the mechanic from the hardware store, walked up and unplugged it. The silence that followed was heavy. I'm calling my lawyers, Sterling hissed, shoving the papers into his briefcase. He looked at Patty with pure venom. If this is true, I'm suing you for everything you have. Breach of contract, misrepresentation, damages. You're finished. He stormed out. Patty was left standing alone. She looked small. All the bluster, all the power, it just evaporated. She looked at me, trembling. You can't do this. I built this community. You didn't build it, Patty, I said softly. You just bullied the people who live in it. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings. The authorities got involved once the fraud accusations started flying. It turned out Patty had been siphoning off the HOA dues into a personal account to fund her lifestyle, banking on the big payout from the developer to cover her tracks before anyone noticed. She was arrested 2 weeks later. The image of her being led out of her pristine White House in handcuffs was something the town would talk about for decades. But then came the hard part. The reality. I owned the land. Technically, I could have evicted everyone. I could have charged them rent. I could have been the tyrant Patty wanted to be. The neighbors were terrified. I'd walk down the street and see people peeking through curtains, waiting for the eviction notice. But I remembered why I came here. I came for peace. I came to escape the greed, not to join it. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I set up a community land trust. I legally transferred the ownership of the individual residential lots to the homeowners for the price of $1 each. They finally, truly owned their homes. But I kept the lake. And I kept the woods. I designated the remaining 600 acres as the Thorne Nature Preserve. No developers. No luxury marinas. No exclusive access. I opened the lake to the public. Anyone could fish, anyone could swim, as long as they respected the silence. The HOA was disbanded and replaced with a volunteer council. Miller is the head of it now. He mostly just organizes potlucks and helps people fix their fences. As for me, I'm still in the cabin. I fixed the roof. I built my deck extension, exactly the way I wanted it. I was sitting out there this morning, coffee in hand, watching the mist rise off the water. A truck pulled up. Patty's old house was sold to a young couple from the city. They waved at me. I waved back. It's funny how life works. I spent 20 years chasing money, thinking that's where the power was. But real power isn't about controlling people or counting zeros in a bank account. Real power is having the leverage to destroy your enemies, and choosing to build a community instead. Well, except for Patty. I destroyed her. And I gotta admit, the fishing has been fantastic ever since she left. So, here's my question to you guys. If you woke up tomorrow and found out you owned your entire town, and the people who made your life miserable were suddenly living on your land, would you have been as nice as I was? Or would the eviction notices have gone out the same day? Let me know in the comments. I read them all while I'm waiting for the fish to bite.